in archery that has become extremely popular where people say you should set your bow up to your natural cant, then level your sight to that cant, and then everything will just track correctly. And from a physics standpoint, that is wrong. Not just kind of wrong and not wrong for some people, but it's physically wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because people are confusing the orientation of the sight with the orientation of the launch plane of the arrow itself. And those are not the same thing. The instant you cant a bow, you rotate the entire launch system of the arrow. You rotate the riser, you rotate the string plane, you rotate the cams, and most importantly, you rotate the launch vector of the arrow itself. And that matters because gravity never rotates. Gravity always acts perfectly vertical relative to the Earth. So if gravity remains vertical, but the launch plane of the arrow rotates sideways, then the arrow is no longer traveling in the same vertical plane as the sight. And the instant that happens, a horizontal component is introduced into the trajectory. That is unavoidable geometry. The easiest way to understand this is actually with long range rifles, because this is universally understood in precision rifle shooting. If a rifle is canted even slightly at distances of a mile, the shooter would miss horizontally by feet, not by inches. Why? Because when the rifle rotates, the bullet's trajectory rotates with it. The bullet is no longer leaving the muzzle directly underneath the sight, and because of this, a horizontal vector is introduced into the bullet's trajectory. The exact same thing happens in archery. The distances are shorter, so the error is smaller, but the geometry is identical. And this is where people make the mistake. They think if the sight bubble is level, then everything must be correct. But the bubble only tells you the orientation of the sight housing relative to gravity. It does not tell you the orientation of the launch plane. The arrow does not care what your bubble says. The arrow only cares about the physical orientation of the bow at launch. So if the bow is canted, then the arrow is physically leaving the bow on a tilted trajectory plane. Always, every single shot. But there's another reason we should know this is true. And honestly, most archers already understand this intuitively, even if they don't realize it. Every experienced shooter knows that if there's a crosswind, you can cant the bow slightly into the wind to help offset wind drift. People do this all the time. If the wind is pushing the arrow left, the shooter cants the bow slightly right, and it works. But think about what that actually means mechanically. If cant supposedly has no effect on horizontal impact as long as the sight is level, then canting into the wind should do absolutely nothing. It should have zero effect, but everyone knows that it does have an effect. Why? Because canting the bow changes the trajectory plane of the arrow. And that's exactly the point. When you rotate the bow, you rotate the launch vector relative to gravity. That creates horizontal displacement. So you cannot simultaneously say canting the bow does not affect horizontal impact as long as the sight is level, and then also say you can cant into the wind to correct horizontal drift. Those two ideas directly contradict each other. The reason canting into the wind works is because cant absolutely does influence horizontal trajectory. But archers already understand this subconsciously because they've seen it happen in the real world. They just haven't connected it back to the actual physics. And again, the farther the arrow travels, the more visible this becomes. At short range, the effect can be tiny, but at long range, the geometry becomes impossible to ignore. Because the longer the arrow is exposed to gravity, the more time that rotated trajectory plane has to separate horizontally from the sight plane itself. So even the cant into the wind concept that archers already use is actually proving the exact same physics that I'm talking about here. Cant changes the launch plane. Changing the launch plane changes horizontal impact. It's non-negotiable. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, I shoot great with a canted bow. And I believe you, but that does not mean the physics stopped existing. What's actually happening is that you've built a compensated system. You tuned the bow around the cant. Things like rest position, cam lean, center shot, your grip pressure, your knock travel, yoke tuning, all of those things begin interacting together. Eventually, the arrow gets redirected back towards the intended line during launch. So, yes, the system can absolutely shoot well, but that does not mean the geometry is correct. It means multiple variables are canceling each other out. And that's a huge difference. The problem with compensating systems is they depend on repeatability. Everything has to happen exactly the same every single shot. the exact same grip pressure, the exact same cant angle, the exact same torque, the exact same release, the exact same shoulder position. If any of those things change even slightly, the compensation changes. And when the compensation changes, the hidden horizontal error immediately comes back. That's why this becomes incredibly important for average archers, because average archers are not perfectly repeatable machines. Now, let's talk about what is actually mechanically correct. The mechanically correct approach is to keep the bow itself plumb level relative to gravity. Not what feels level, actually level. That keeps the launch plane of the arrow aligned vertically with gravity. Then, if the arrow impacts left or right at long range, you adjust the first axis slightly so the sight's vertical tracking matches the actual trajectory plane of the arrow. That is fundamentally a different concept. You are not rotating the launch system away from gravity. You are keeping the bow physically aligned correctly while adjusting the sight system to track the true path of the arrow. That creates a much more mechanically stable system because the launch plane itself remains correctly orientated relative to gravity. This dramatically reduces the dependence on compensationable variables. And that matters because the more mechanically correct a system becomes, the less perfect the shooter has to be. And that's the entire goal. People need to stop thinking what feels level and start thinking what keeps the launch plane correctly aligned with gravity, because the physics does not care what feels natural. Physics only cares about the geometry. And the geometry is extremely clear. If the bow is canted, the launch plane rotates. If the launch plane rotates relative to gravity, a horizontal component is introduced into the trajectory. The farther the arrow travels, the more obvious the error becomes. That is why cant errors show up dramatically at long ranges and on steep angled shots. Again, this is not my opinion. This is just projectile geometry, and the bow determines the launch vector. The launch vector determines the trajectory plane. And if the trajectory plane is tilted relative to gravity, horizontal error becomes mathematically unavoidable every single time.